Ooh. Hello, YouTubers! My name's Willie. Welcome to my channel. Today I have reaction request video 121. The Black Dragons of the Cursed Founding. This is brought to us by Arch, part of Arch's Cursed Founding lore videos, and was requested by CJ Falcon. So let's check it out. Okay, let's see here. Play. Dun dun. Dun dun.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore, specifically more about the Cursed Founding. And we shall, of course, start with the Black Dragons, because, well, awesome, basically.
Yeah,
they're Astartes with claws and horns and shit. How could we not start with them? What's that? I hear some loud crying in the background. That's probably the Lamenters. We'll get to those, don't worry, but first, awesome. So, as I mentioned in the first video in this series, the Cursed Founding happened at the end of the 36th millennium, right before the start of the Age of Apostasy, where everything went to hell in a fucking handbasket, and everyone started murdering, well, pretty much everyone at the same time, pretty much. The Black Dragons themselves were, what should I say, one of the more successful experiments? I guess that would be fair enough. I mean, they're still loyal as far as we know, and they're not particularly fond of killing civilians, so yeah, by the metrics of the Cursed Founding, that is pretty much a success. The fact that they also appear to be hideously mutated monstrosities that test the almost limitless patience of the Imperial Inquisition to its very limits is, well, a minor detail in the grand scheme of things. Because at least in the case of the Black Dragons, their problem is, well, mostly cosmetic. They're not batshit insane, or constantly wreathed in hell flames, or have some kind of cosmic curse placed upon them. Everything considered, the Black Dragons got out of all of this pretty damn lightly. If you can consider growing gigantic and presumably very, very painful growths out of your forehead and, well, arms to be lightly, but again, everything is relevant. And speaking of relevance, why precisely are the Black Dragons looking like, well, black dragons? As usual, the devil is in the details. In the Black Dragon's case, it is the second implant to be implanted within a neophyte to turn him into a full Space Marine, the Os Modular, also known as the Iron Heart. This is, as mentioned, the second of 19 gene seed organs implanted into a Space Marine neophyte during his creation process. Normally, the job of the Os Modular is to strengthen the initiate's skeletal structure, increase his bone growth, and also increase the rate at which he grows muscles. When combined with an effective hormone treatment and a diet laced with microscopic ceramic-based minerals, this allows the Astartes to grow a considerable amount of muscular and bone mass very, very quickly. In the case of the Black Dragons, the Os Modular somewhat misbehaves, and instead of just growing the bone growth that is usually associated with Space Marines, like, for example, denser bone growth overall, and closing up the entirety of the chest cavities, creating a solid bone chest plate rather than the usual ribs that a human has, in this case, it also makes them occasionally, not always, #not all, grow horns and giant protruding spikes out of their arms. But that is, of course,
relatively
not quite
useful
the end of
sometimes.
them. These are by far the most obvious mutations, but they also possess a few more subtle ones.
Oh, yeah?
For example, their mandibles and the teeth of the Black Dragon Astartes are quite unusual. Their canines grow overlong, kinda like the Space Wolves, except they also constantly drip with poison, which I imagine must produce a rather annoying taste. That might explain why the black dragons are so annoyed all the time. I mean, imagine if anything you ever ate essentially tasted like bile. That'd probably piss you off at some point, wouldn't it? Additionally, their tongues are not entirely normal, possibly due to all of the poison they keep ingesting all the goddamn time. Now, of course, their Astartes biology is more than capable of dealing with such a, relatively speaking, weak poison. Relatively. But it does turn their mouths and their tongues black. And additionally, their tongues almost universally taper into a dagger-like point. And these various mutations have strained the tolerance of the Emperor's Inquisition to the veritable breaking point. But, as of yet, the Black Dragons have not done anything that the Inquisition can prove to be overly heretical. So far, the Black Dragons have proved themselves to be a loyal and, perhaps even more importantly, effective chapter. And they haven't really been able to pin anything on them. At most, they have some unsubstantiated rumors suggesting that Black Dragon apothecaries in some way encourage the growth of these organs and mutations, especially the claws, to be used as natural weapons. Now, of course, a simple bone protrusion, even though it is Astartes bone, would not necessarily be a particularly effective weapon. Bone, after all, being somewhat brittle by comparison to, for example, steel. Thusly, the Dragon Claws units sheathe their bony protrusions in layers of adamantium, which quite effectively turns the bony protrusion into a fully functional close combat weapon that can both be used to parry and maul one's enemies equally effectively without having to worry about the inconvenience of having one's weapon break. And the units created from the individuals cursed and or blessed with this mutation, known as the Dragon Claws, have shown themselves to be quite effective. As such, there might be some truth to the rumors that they are deliberately trying to create these mutated individuals. Doing so, however, would be in clear violation of the edicts laid down by the High Lords, and would probably get the entire chapter declared excommunicatus traitoris. So they are, if they are doing it, treading a rather dangerous line. And it should be noted that since they do allow the Dragon Claws to cover their bony protrusions and adamantium, there is at the very least a tacit approval of their mutations within the chapter. So it is not beyond the realms of possibilities that they do in fact encourage this. At the very least, they do not actively discriminate against the members of their chapter that have these mutations. In fact, they would appear to value them quite highly, considering the fact that not only are they fine in using relatively valuable materials and augmenting them, they also organize them into specialized squads of so-called Dragon Claws, as mentioned, and these are considered to be the chapter's elite assault troops, which is a position that holds a fair bit of status. It is not like, for example, with the Death Company inside of the Blood Angels, where the Death Company are treated kind of like an asylum. They are almost treated like they are already dead. They are... Actually, no, that is a pretty good analogy. They are treated as if they are the honored dead, and all that remains is to provide them with the opportunity to, well, stop moving, basically. Basically, the status of the Dragon Claws within the chapter is a little unclear. Now, we do know that they look up to those in their ranks who are not affected by the mutations with a certain admiration. They consider those that have not been affected at all as purer than those who have been. They are considered to be closer to the ideal, so to say. And this, again, goes pretty much entirely contrary to the idea that they organize the Dragon Claws into elite assault squads and expend a fair bit of resources upon them. Again, grafting adamantium onto human bone, I imagine, would be a rather tough process, requiring a fair bit of expertise. It's not like they can simply just dip bone in melted adamantium. The temperature alone would probably provide a fair bit of problems, let us say. It also appears that the Black Dragons are not particularly fond of other Imperial servants. Now, to be fair, that dislike runs both ways. There are a great deal of Imperial organizations that will simply just flat out refuse to cooperate with the Black Dragons. But the little dragon wagons are not entirely free of blame themselves. For example, in the case of one of their lost brethren, one Captain Zartar. Zartar had been captured by Dark Eldar, which is an unfortunate fate at the best of fucking times, and had been driven completely and utterly bonkers until he was rescued somewhat unintentionally by the Salamanders chapter. The Salamanders tried to fix his broken sanity and more or less succeeded, and introduced him into their own scout auxiliaries for a time being. Eventually, however, the Black Dragons reunited with their lost captain. Now, the Salamanders had tried to return Captain Zarta to the Black Dragons, but had been unable to contact them. So, when the Black Dragons found them first, they naturally assumed the absolute fucking worst and simply assaulted the Salamander's vessel, the Forge Hammer, boarding it rather aggressively and leaving at least one battle brother dead, before essentially just taking their captain back with them. Now, this is indicative that they have an incredibly hostile relationship with other Imperial organizations, since generally speaking, sending a fucking boarding party over is not usually considered to be the correct diplomatic step.
Yeah, probably
Though again,
not.
to be fair to the poor little dragons, they might have overreacted due to the fact that it was a salamander vessel, and upon discovering that their captain was indeed not a prisoner, they did surrender to the salamanders immediately thereafter. And the salamanders and the Black Dragons appear to have a particularly strange relationship, and this may be due to the rumor that the Black Dragons hail from Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders. Now, I imagine the Salamanders would take issue with that because, one, the Mechanicus were clearly using their Primarch's gene seed for some no-goodery bullshit, which is one of the reasons why they should also be actively hunting down every last Primaris Marine, but hey, fucking details. And they would probably view the Black Dragons as, well, pretty much a living insult to their Primarch, seeing as their very existence insinuates that there was something wrong with Vulcan's gene seed. Personally, I'm not entirely convinced that they're actually salamanders, because they have on multiple occasions shown that they don't actually give a flying fetching fuck about civilians. For an example, we have an event where they boarded a vast Dark Elf ship filled to the absolute gills with prisoners. They could not overcome the Dark Elves on board, so instead they flooded the entirety of the ship with pure oxygen, and then introduced a spark into said atmosphere, which completely gutted the entire ship, including its populations of slaves, in a massive inferno. Now, the Inferno thing is definitely Salamander-esque, but throwing away tens of thousands, if not more, civilian lives purely to defeat one's enemies, that's not quite as Salamander-esque. Remember, the Salamanders are so fanatic when it comes to protecting the civilians in the Imperium that they will actively and knowingly gimp their own battle plans to protect said civilian population. Personally, I would suggest a different heritage. Namely, of course, Sanguinius. Now granted, the Angel was not exactly famed for growing bone blades out of his arms, but then again, neither was Vulcan. And the sheer ferocity of the Black Dragons would certainly seem to suggest some Blood Angel in their bloodstream. Perhaps even worse, the Cursed Founding tried to mix gene seed from different Primarchs. Now that would be a truly nasty little experiment.
Very problematic.
I doubt it would work, however, since the DNA of one would probably try and overwrite the other, but interesting little thought. Plus, the guys that are most affected by the Black Dragon's mutations, the growth of these bony weapons and the crests on their heads, are also suffering from a little bit of a mental deficiency. They tend to be far more ferocious than their battle brothers, nowhere near to the level of the Death Company, of course, but still a marked difference compared to the rest of their battle brothers, which might suggest just a hint of the Red Thirst. And there is one further little interesting suggestion to be made here. You see, As with all Space Marine chapters, they are required to offer up 5% of their gene seed to the Imperium. This is used both to test for deviancies and other such nonsense, and to build up a vast bank of gene seed, which can be issued to chapters that are either in dire need of more gene seed, or might even be used to found entirely new chapters if the need arises. Now, most chapters give over this tithe relatively willingly, since this is essentially their way of going, we are good boys, and would never think of doing anything ridiculous like becoming heretic traitors or anything. Oh, no, not us.
Yeah.
However, the Black Dragons, like some other chapters, are somewhat hesitant to hand over their tithe of gene seed. The reasons should be rather obvious.
Yeah.
However, here's the real twist. When they eventually do hand over their gene seed, often after having been directly threatened with some form of military action, for example, the gene seed passes every last one of the most stringent tests imaginable.
Really?
Which seems exceedingly odd, considering the fact that they have some rather obvious mutations, and yet their gene seed does not even have the vaguest suggestion of mutation. Huh. Now, I'm not saying that jet fuel can't melt steel beams or anything, but maybe, just maybe, this gene seed isn't their gene seed at all. Now, how precisely they come across this gene seed, which might not be theirs, well, you know, accidents do happen. And we do have an example of at least one time in which the Black Dragons decided to board first and ask questions later. Now, again, this is not necessarily anything conclusive.
Interesting.
Something to think about.
It's
just
kinda
a
suggesting,
little bit,
though.
isn't it? Considering the fact that it would appear as if the chapter itself is kind of tearing itself apart internally with two opposing value sets. On one hand, the Dragon Claws units are very, very effective, and are given a bit of status because of it. On the other hand, they also see the pure members of their chapter as special, and something to be taken particular care of and heed of. We have, for example, seen that in a case where a group of Astartes do not have access to any of their usual command structure, in the case of the Black Dragons, they will then defer to the quote-unquote purest amongst them, the one with the least or even perhaps no mutations, which in turn quite clearly shows that they venerate and look up to these members, which is in stark contrast to the fact that the Dragon Claws are so damn effective at tearing their enemies limb from limbs.
Yeah.
In other words, it seems to me as if the Black Dragons chapter is at almost a state of war with itself. It is struggling to find itself, as melodramatic as that might sound, and rediscover their proper identity. Are they noble Astartes? Are they mutants? Should they be ashamed of the fact that they do have these mutations? Should they embrace them? Should they consider themselves to be in the Imperium, or merely just allies of the Imperium? Or perhaps even, should they consider themselves to be separate of and outside the Imperium?
Ooh.
Who do they really serve? Do they serve the Emperor? And if he knows and sees everything, surely he must have intended this. Or do they serve the Imperium, which are questioning their very heritage, and are looking for any excuse they can to purge them? But then again, the Emperor's Inquisition is acting on the behalf of the Emperor. They are in fact the closest to the Emperor's authority that exists within the Imperium, and they clearly have it out for us, so is it right to fight against them? Perhaps we should just surrender,
That's
but then
very
again,
tough.
we are
That's
clearly
very tough
fighting the
indeed.
good fight, and so on, and so on, and so on. It would again appear to me as if the Black Dragons struggle with all of these contradictionary terms. They can't quite figure out what they are and how they fit within the Imperium. This means that they will on occasion lash out against that very Imperium that they also so desperately try to protect. And I would also say that it might lend a little bit of further credence to the idea that perhaps the Cursed Founding were experimenting with more than just modifications to the gene seed. Perhaps they were even attempting to mix gene seed. Now again, how that would precisely work, considering the fact that gene seed essentially overwrites the genetical structure of the target, I have no idea. I have no basis for this. This is pure speculation. But it would to some extent explain the opposites within the Black Dragons, the apparent nobility and yet also the apparent ferocity. They are, in every way, a chapter of opposites, struggling to come to grip with their situation and their existence within an Imperium that looks upon them with deep-seated suspicion. Whether or not they will find their true path as loyalist Space Marines, or simply just say fuck it and turn truly and fully to chaos, which a few of their members have already done, is yet to be determined. But either way, the Black Dragons are destined, it would seem, to live in interesting times. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.
You too, Arch. Well, that's some interesting stuff. So again, that was brought to us by Arch Warhammer as part of his Cursed Founding lore series. This one was called The Black Dragons, and such, focused on said subject. If you want to check out his stuff, there is a link in the description to help you find his channel. Highly recommended. It's really good. And this was requested by CJ Falcon. Thank you for requesting that. Quite entertaining stuff indeed, and it's really nice to be learning about these Astartes. My thoughts on it, what I learned and such. Well, Black Dragons with their mutations and malforms, and yet they seem to fight their inner being and support two groups, one that's highly mutated and one that's perfectly unmutated. They're also quite savage against other Astartes, potentially, and yeah, it's a very interesting group indeed. Got a whole Wolverine thing going on with that coating bone and adamantium and a very strong metal that has to be very hot to be coated. Yeah, that stuff. Anyways, yeah, it's cool to learn about these characters, because later on you'll see them in stories and you'll be like, oh, okay, now I understand some of why they do this, or at least some function of them. So anyways, I know that was very short as far as thoughts and what I learned. There was a lot there, but I think I'm going to end it there. Till next time, Willie, out.
If you like the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to comment. Have a good one.